And good morning, everyone. Welcome to the virtual floating classroom. This is an event we have put together to every single AMIkids program, employee, and youth, and we hope you enjoy it. I'm here with Miss Alison Goldy. She is an educator for Mote Marine Laboratory and Aquarium, and I'm going to let her introduce herself.
Yeah, so hi everyone. Thanks for being here with us. Thanks for joining. We're gonna have a lot of fun today. So I am an educator at Mote Marine Lab and I have lots of background in research, but of course education as well. So I'll be leading you through this virtual floating classroom experience. And just a reminder, as you are watching some of our segments, start to think about some of the questions you might have about what you're learning. Maybe it's something new or maybe something that you want reinforced. But we're going to definitely open it up to some Q&A in between each segment. So I'll be able to answer any questions that you have during that time we've allotted.
I wanted to do some housekeeping. So I have a few notes here. If you go to your window where you're seeing us right now, and you see the name AMIkids Presenter, that is the main video stream. Next to that name, there are three dots. If you click those three dots, a menu is gonna pop up. And I want you to click Fit to Frame. So go ahead and do that right now. Go to AMIkids Presenter and click Fit to Frame. The reason we're doing this is because the videos we have need to be in the right aspect ratio. So that's going to help you enjoy the videos in the best possible way. Also, open the chat function that's located on the upper right corner of your Teams video. And I see a lot of activity there. We're familiar with it. But make sure you open the chat function and start writing any questions you may have right there, because Alison and I are going to be answering those questions. So it's important that we have them ahead of time so you get an answer. And I just have one more thing here. Please, again, write down how many staff and how many youth are with you right now so we can keep a head count. Alison?
Yeah, so we're going to have a lot of fun today. I hope you enjoy this floating classroom virtually. And let's go check out the boat and see what kind of environment we have out there. Hey, Bob.
Hey, Allison.
Everyone, I'd love to introduce you to Captain Bob. He's the one in charge of taking us to all the best sampling spots and, of course, keeping us safe on the boat. Hey, Bob, would you mind taking us for a tour of the boat?
I'd be glad to. Hey, thanks everybody for joining us for this floating classroom experience. I'd like to show you our flagship vessel, Orlando's Rose. It was donated to us by Mr. Burrows, and we use it regularly for our floating classroom and our challenge events. Let's go inside now. This is the salon area and main laboratory facility for the floating classroom on Orlando's Rose. And these stairs lead down to our engine room, where I'd like to show you next. So this is the engine room for Orlando's Rose. Our main engines are Cummins turbo diesels. They're 715 horsepower apiece, and they drive two large jet pumps behind the engines that provide our propulsion. We also have two generators in here that provide all the AC power for it, our air conditioning plant and our water maker plant. Most of the time we get underway and re-operate these things at about 2,500 RPM and get a speed of about 18 knots. So let's go up forward and we'll check out the well deck. So this is our well deck where we conduct most of our diving operations and portions of the floating classroom. One of the interesting features of the well deck is the forward gangway. The entire front of the boat drops down and allows people to go out and go ashore and do their diving and stuff. So this is the helm station. It's the area we operate the vessel from and control the engines and the steering and the bow thruster. So here at the helm station, we have the main controls for the engines and for the jet operating stick. And we have our navigational displays and our engine instrumentation. We have a radio and an autopilot.
So we've landed at one of our first sampling sites, but before we hop off and do some sampling, I just wanted to give you an idea of where we are, especially since some of you may live somewhere else other than Florida. So we are in Tampa Bay, which is on the west coast of Florida, about halfway down the state, and we're in a really special type of environment called an estuary. So an estuary is defined by having brackish water, which basically means it's not full-strength ocean water, it's a mix of salty and fresh. Where's that fresh water coming from? Well, it's coming from the land. So any sort of rivers or creeks that run into the ocean are bringing fresh water in that mixes up with the ocean water. So we are going to explore some different kinds of environments present within an estuary. Estuaries also happen to be a little bit protected by land, and they're also generally pretty shallow. So we find things like seagrass beds and mangrove forests. So the animals that live within an estuary type environment have to adapt to a lot of changing conditions like tides, or like salinity, which is the saltiness of the water. So we're actually going to check what the salinity is of our bay right now using a scientific tool called a hydrometer. This basically measures the specific gravity of the water, which means salt water is heavier than fresh water. So the more the arrow goes up, the saltier it is. So regular ocean salt water is about 35 parts per thousand, which means if you had 1,000 buckets of water, 35 of those would actually be just salt. So let's head down to the stern platform and we're gonna check out our salinity. Come on. So I'm gonna take this beaker and I'm gonna fill it up with water and then I'm gonna pour it into the hydrometer. So I have a good scoop of water here and I'm gonna pour it into our hydrometer. There is a maximum fill line, so we're gonna fill that nice and tall here. Already you see that arrow moving, but you might also notice there are lots of air bubbles attaching to that arrow and to the sides of the hydrometer. So we're just gonna do a very scientific thing, and we are going to tap those bubbles out. All right, so you see how that arrow drops, and you'll see the arrow wavering. You're gonna read the outside line here. Right between 22 and 24, so we're at about 23 parts per thousand salinity. Things that might change the salinity are if it's a hot day, the water is going to be evaporating and might leave some salt behind, or if it's really rainy, we might get a lot more fresh water running off into the bay, and that would make it less saline as well. We were talking about stingrays and how they are present out in our estuaries. They do like to kind of cruise along seagrass beds, and if you would like to avoid being stung by them, you do what's called the stingray shuffle. Basically, you just move your feet in the water. That lets them know that you're present and they won't feel threatened by you being there. They never use that barb for aggressive action. It's just for defense.
It's never a good live event without some glitches. So here's a question. Why is ocean water salty?
Oh, this is such a good question. So to be honest with you, I just learned this recently, and I do have a marine biology background, and they don't teach you this. So salt comes from two different places. One is the land, actually, believe it or not. As it rains, through weathering processes, all the rocks, geologic material on the land side get worn down. And so those minerals eventually flow into the ocean and just over time accumulate and make our oceans really salty. There are some deep sea vents that also kind of leach salt into those deeper areas, but in general, the saltiness of the ocean comes from the land.
So does the salt keep the water clean?
Not necessarily. You can definitely have some polluted ocean water. I'm sure you've heard of the Great Pacific Ocean Gyre, the garbage patch. And even coastally here where we are in Tampa Bay, just because that water is salty doesn't mean it can't be polluted with chemicals, fertilizers, pesticides, whatever it is running off land. Also in the bay, because it is an estuary and it's pretty shallow, the wind will kind of churn up the bottom sometimes. So even the clarity of the water, how clear or cloudy it is, doesn't tell us how polluted it is.
So is the salt in the water the same salt that we eat at home?
Oh, great question. So it is not. So the table salt that we use to season our food is sodium chloride. And yes, that is present in salt water. But at Mote Marine Aquarium, if we need to make salt water, it's not as simple as taking tap water and Morton's table salt and adding it together and putting it in the tank. It's much more than that. There are a lot of other minerals present.
We have a question here that says, how do you know how fast the boat is going? That's a good question. And I'll answer it.
Sure.
We have GPSs. So the GPS will tell us how fast we're going. It's the same way that you would have it in your phone when you're driving around. And another question from Joyce, it says, can the boat get up to around 30 knots? There are some boats that can get to that speed. Our flagship, the Orlando's Rose, does not get to that speed. It's a little bit slower. But there are smaller boats and larger boats too that can get up to 30, 40, 50 knots. Keep writing your questions, and I'm going to go back to Ms. Allison.
Yeah, so thank you for those questions. Keep them coming. Remember, as you're watching the segments, to type those into the chat, and then we'll have our answers ready to go when we come back live. But for now, let's check out another habitat within an estuary, the mangrove forest. So here we are in a mangrove forest, which is one of the really unique habitats in an estuary. I'm going to teach you about all 3 species of mangroves that exist here in Florida and teach you to know how to identify them. So first, let's talk about what a mangrove even is. Now, I'm standing directly in the seawater, and even though it's brackish, it has a lot of salt. So if you were to take ocean water and water your plants at home or your garden, what would happen? They would die, right? So these mangrove trees have adapted to be able to live in a really salty environment. So I'll teach you how they do that as well. Let's take a look at these roots though. This is a red mangrove tree. They have what's known as crop roots. And this tree is also known as the walking tree because as you can see, the roots look a lot like legs. And so what they'll do is they will actually root into the ground. They grow towards the seabed, and when it's really wavy, like it's starting to get right now, it keeps that tree nice and stable. And even when it's high tide, the tree can still do gas exchange because, believe it or not, they have to breathe just like we do. Another cool thing about red mangroves is these roots provide a lot of habitat for organisms like barnacles, which are growing on the roots. They are cemented onto those roots and they take advantage of this fresh water flow when they filter feed. So now that we've learned about the roots of the red mangrove, let's check out the leaves. So the leaves of the red mangrove are really easy to tell because this is the tree that grows closest in the water. So their leaves need to be really waxy because they just keep the salt out altogether. So the leaves are fairly waxy and green, but generally they come to a little bit of a point at the top. So our rhyme that we use to remember this is red, red, pointy head, okay? And they're basically the same color on both sides. Now, another cool thing that red mangroves do to live in salty water, they just send all their salt to one sacrificial leaf. And then this one kind of takes it for the team, and that one goes away, taking all the salt with it. So one cool fun fact about red mangroves is that a whole mangrove island can form from one propagule. This is basically the seedling, and it grows from the tree. It drops down into the ocean and it floats horizontally for a while until it feels like it's in a good spot to grow. Then it flips this way vertically and it sinks down, and then it'll start to grow roots and leaves and turn into a whole tree. While that tree is growing, it drops those sacrificial leaves, and eventually over time those leaves turn into dirt. Migratory birds come, bring other seeds, and it forms an entire ecosystem island. All right, so here we have a black mangrove tree. And you remember with the red mangrove, we had the prop roots. With the black mangrove, they actually have snorkel roots. So the roots are coming out of the sand, but basically have the same function of the red mangrove roots, which is they allow the tree to breathe even at high tide. So black mangrove leaves are a little bit different than red mangroves. They're usually the second tree back from growing right in the water. The one side is fairly green. They're not quite as waxy as red mangrove leaves, but the back side is really light. And so whereas red mangrove leaves have sacrificial leaves that they put all the salt into, black mangrove leaves just excrete the salt on both sides of the leaf. So if you ever find yourself wondering what kind of mangrove it is, you can just lick the back and it's really salty. And in fact, local Native Americans here in Florida used to use that salt in seasonings. So we learned red, salty head to remember the red mangrove leaf. For the black mangrove leaf, your rhyme can be black, salty back. So we've got our rhyme for red mangroves and black mangroves. White mangroves don't really have any special type of roots, but they are usually third, the farthest away from the seawater. So I'm going to teach you the rhyme for the leaf, which has two sugar nectaries located right at the base of the leaf. And those sugar nectaries usually attract some ants, so that's a good way to tell that it's a white mangrove tree. And the rhyme is white, bolts on tight, like Frankenstein. So not only are mangroves really cool to look at, they actually have a really important role in an estuary. Number one, if you look at these roots here, they trap a lot of garbage coming off the land. So they act as sort of a barrier from the land side to the ocean. They also help to filter out any water that's running off the land into the bays. From the ocean side, here in Florida, you may have heard or you may know, we get lots of weather, including hurricanes. And so mangroves act as a physical barrier to all that wave action and prevent a lot of flooding from occurring on the land side. In addition, these trees are protected. And another reason is that they actually stabilize the shoreline, meaning those roots keep the soil in place and they keep the shoreline from eroding into the ocean. Of course, they also provide a lot of food, a lot of habitat, and in fact, an estuary is a great place for young ocean life to grow up. So it's known as the nursery of the sea, and we're gonna go ahead and explore another part of an estuary with dip nets, looking for some of these young ocean animals, and we're also gonna check it out with an underwater drone.
Super low, they say.
Super low. Okay. Well, that's good because I'm not a botanist and I actually don't know the answer to that question. But I do know that a lot of plants that need to be protected or retain water will form this sort of waxy cuticle on the outside. So think of succulents or desert plants. It's a way of protecting that plant and a way of keeping all that water inside so that they don't dry out. So I imagine red mangroves are similar.
So we had no sound.
No sound still?
No, we had no sound. So the question was about the waxiness of the leaves. Now, let me put you another question there. How can a saltwater plant like a white mangrove create sugar? That's pretty weird.
So through the process of photosynthesis, there are lots of processes that take place inside of a plant, and so that happens to be one byproduct of photosynthesis. So instead of using that for energy, they just kind of they use part of it for energy and just excrete some of that on the outside of their stem.
Let me make a quick sound check here. Anyone in the chat, can you hear us? I see a question. It says, is the mangrove forest the only sea forest? Someone give me a little bit of feedback. Yeah, sounds good. Okay.
Everyone can hear?
All right, I got plenty. That's awesome. Thank you. Is the mangrove forest the only sea forest?
So not necessarily. There are trees that are not mangroves that grow coastally. One example here in Florida is the buttonwood. It's not technically a mangrove, but it does grow in association with those 3 species that we talked about. And even though we only have 3 species of mangroves here, all around the world, there are lots of different species of mangroves. And I imagine there are also some other plants, maybe not necessarily that grow directly in the water that are trees like that, but we definitely have very salt tolerant plants that are growing on the beach or at least close to the water.
Now, when you talk about forests, I love the concept. And so what can you tell us about something like seagrass forests? Are there such thing as that?
Yeah, so in a seagrass forest, we call it more a seagrass bed or a seagrass meadow. And a lot of people confuse seagrass with seaweed. It's not the same thing. Seagrass is actually not even a grass. It's a true flowering plant. So it's not like grass we have on land. It's more like a flowering plant that we have on land, only it grows underwater. And instead of having bees and moths and butterflies as pollinators, it has crabs. So they will produce flowers, and they create an amazing habitat for a lot of our young ocean life, as I mentioned earlier, that need to have some protection, some food, and a home to live in.
And we have a question from Courtney. It says, can both trees grow in the same places? And I'm guessing that question is relating to mangroves and the 3 types of mangroves that we discussed. So what can you tell us, Alison, about how mangroves grow in different areas of the estuary?
Yeah, so I think the question is, can you have a red mangrove, a white mangrove, black mangrove all in the same area? And the answer is yes. In general, red mangroves are the ones that grow directly in the water, but I have seen black mangroves doing the same. White mangroves are way less salt tolerant, so they're a little bit further back from the water. And they don't have to grow all together. You could just have red mangroves or just black mangroves or just white mangroves.
And last question for now. Keep them coming. Keep putting your questions in the chat. And there's a question from Scott that says, why are the mangroves names based on colors? I think that's pretty interesting.
It has to do a little bit with the color of the trunk and the roots. So for red mangrove, they've got these crazy prop roots that are really red. The black and the white mangrove, I'm actually not quite sure, but I know white mangroves do have a white flower. So I will look that up and I'll get back to you. But let's go head out back into the water and check out some of those young ocean animals that we can find using a dip net. All right, you guys, so I'm about to use a dip net to sample the bottom of the seabed, and we'll see what we can find. Maybe crabs, fish, snails, who knows? Woo! All right, so we found our first catch of the day. It is a blue crab, and it is moving around. The reason you can tell it's a blue crab is if you look at those back legs, they don't look like the rest of them. So they have 3 pairs of walking legs, and then they have these swimmerettes, which are basically used to swim, just like the name suggests. So they look more like boat oars or paddles, and that helps them to kind of scoot along in the water. Okay, so it's really fun finding these organisms, and I do have a permit from Mote to collect them, but part of that permit is that we release them when we're done using them. So I'm going to go ahead and let this crab live its life, grow up into a big blue crab, and here we go. Let's continue sampling and see what else we can find. Ooh! So remember, a lot of the things we're finding are going to be kind of small. I found a type of mollusk, which is basically something soft with a hard shell. This is a bivalve, meaning it has two shells, so like a clam or a mussel. And it's a really, really beautiful shell that we found here. And you can tell that there's an animal living inside because the shell is closed. Both parts are closed. I think I found something kind of big. Let's see what it is. Feels heavy. Oh, cool, look. All right, so this looks like a big rock, but it's a bunch of oysters that have cemented themselves together. So it's a bit of an oyster bed. And I bet if we look closely, we might be able to find a crab hiding in there. Part of sampling is using your scientific observation skills, and sometimes you have to look really closely in order to find something. I do see some barnacles up here on the top. These are living animals, and they filter feed basically upside down with a feathery foot. But that's this shell right here that looks kind of like a volcano. I don't see any crabs in here right now, but it definitely could be hiding somewhere in there. Still pretty cool. Okay, so I'm going to put this back in the water, and let's go on shore, see if maybe we can find something crawling on the mangrove roots or in the trees. So remember how we were talking about the roots trapping trash from the land? Unfortunately, that is what I found right here. So we're going to go ahead and collect it and put it into a bucket so it doesn't harm the environment anymore. Even though some organisms may grow on it, it's obviously been here for quite some time. This is not what belongs out in our environment, and this is one of the biggest threats to estuaries today.
We're back live. We have sound. Can you hear us? Good. All right. So, Alison, what other animals besides the ones we found in this video grow in the estuary?
So in seagrass beds in particular, but even in sandy areas, we have a lot of invertebrates. So I did actually bring with me a couple things to show you. So for example, this is a huge one. We wouldn't find one this big, but sea stars are really common in the estuary. We might also find different kinds of crabs, like spider crabs, blue crabs. We also have a number of different mollusks or snails. So I did bring, this is a lightning whelk shell. Fun fact, it's the only one around here that opens up on the left side. You might find something like this too, which is actually the eggs from a lightning whelk. So baby snails come from that. And then we find some really cool fish, like seahorses even. They love to live in estuaries because it's nice and protected. They can hang on to the seagrass. And we often find pufferfish as well. So this one is a striped burrfish. You can see that stripy pattern. But generally when we catch them in a dip net, they're really, really tiny.
Some questions, Alison. Why do mollusks have two shells?
Okay, so when we're talking about mollusks, there are actually a couple different categories of mollusks. So something like a snail is a gastropod. It only has one shell, and that is its home, its protection, because the animal that lives on the inside is very vulnerable and squishy. So that's how it stays safe. But when we have animals like scallops, this would normally have two shells, right? So we call these bivalves because they have a hinged shell with two parts. And again, it's for protection. So a lot of these animals will filter feed and they'll open up a little bit, get some food, clean our water for us, and then when they're done, they'll close up to stay safe.
These are the best questions that are popping out.
Yeah.
Miss Newton, we got your question here. What do barnacles and crabs eat?
Yeah, so weirdly enough, they are related. I do have a different kind of barnacle, just the shell here. So it's kind of like a volcano shell. They're also filter feeders. So they're eating teeny tiny particles in the ocean. It could be plankton or just floating organic material that's really small for them. Crabs are a little bit different. Crabs can pretty much eat anything. whatever they find is good for them. So they might eat some plants, they might eat some animals. But when you're thinking about what animals eat, think about where they live, right? So crabs are along the benthic zone and along the seafloor, so they're going to be eating whatever's hanging out there.
This is the best question I've seen so far. Can fish see water? Ooh,
Can fish see water?
Can fish see water? I love the way you're thinking, guys. And water is generally transparent.
I'm not even sure how to answer that question, and I love when questions stump me because it makes me think, and you teach me often too. Fish have varying degrees of eyesight, and they know that they're in the environment, but just like we can't really see air, I would say they can't really see water. However, when they are in an aquarium or some sort of enclosed area, they are aware that there's something different on the other side. Hopefully that answers your question.
I guess they can see turbidity, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So when we're talking about water quality, absolutely, fish can tell if they have a beautiful clear view or if it's a little bit cloudy and murky and they might have a hard time finding their food or hiding from predators.
All right, we're running on the clock here. I have a few questions that I'm saving, but I'm gonna send it back to Alison, and we're saving all your questions for every questions will be answered.
Yes, and thank you so much for keeping them coming. So we've explored mangroves, we've explored the seagrass with dip nets, and now we're going to check out something that's even smaller. So what some of these filter feeding organisms eat, which is plankton. So some of the smaller organisms in an estuary are actually the most important, even though you can't see them. We're talking about plankton. Now, plankton is teeny tiny plants and animals, and they form the base of the food chain. So everything on up that food chain is going to rely on the health and thriving of that plankton ecosystem. Also, everyone take a really deep breath. Half of our oxygen actually come from plankton. We all think it comes from trees, but we have the ocean to thank for that. So we're going to sample some of our smallest living organisms in the bay using a plankton net. So these are going to be microscopic organisms that we're going to collect with this really, really fine mesh. And then as the water comes out, all the critters are going to concentrate in this bottle at the bottom. So I'm going to go down to the stern again, and I'll show you how I deploy a plankton net and see what we can find. All right, so it's looking good. I tossed out the net a couple times to collect as much as we can. I can actually see things through this clear bottle, but I think we should get a closer look and check them out under the microscope. Now that we've collected our plankton, let's transfer it to a petri dish so we can look at it under this microscope. So I'm just going to unscrew this bottle from the attachment here. And I've brought along a pipette to help me transfer into the petri dish. So I'm going to give it a little bit of a swirl, make sure everything's concentrated in there. And then I'm going to put some of our sample onto this petri dish. And thankfully, this microscope is attached to this computer, so we get to see all the cool creatures right on the screen. So anything that we see moving on this screen is going to be animal or zooplankton. And most of the things that are not moving and are colored green, those are going to be our plant plankton or phytoplankton. And a lot of this animal plankton that we see actually grow into some of the animals that we caught while dip netting earlier. So it's really important that we keep our water nice and clean and healthy to allow this plankton to grow into its adult form. So what I have here is a really cool piece of equipment and technology that's going to help us to actually see underwater. It's known as an ROV, or a remotely operated vehicle. essentially it's an underwater drone. So let me show you it and we'll see if we can deploy it and check out what's in those mangroves over there. So let me show you all the cool features that this underwater drone has. So up at the front here, it has a camera. That's how we're going to see all the cool stuff underwater. It also has some lights to provide a little bit of illumination for us. And then on the back here, this is actually how it moves. So these are two propellers that will move it forward. And then of course it also has to adjust its buoyancy, whether it's floating or sinking in the water. That's what this propeller does. So I'm going to go ahead and put it in the water. Let's see what we can find. Okay, so I'm going to grab my remote and see if I can drive this drone all the way over to our mangroves. Okay, so we are inside, and what I see on my screen, you are soon going to be able to see on our big TV. So I'm going to try and drive our drone around and see what we can find. All right, so immediately we see a bunch of fish. These look like maybe some snapper cruising along the bottom. Let's see what else we can find. So you'll notice these fish are not very colorful. That's because they blend in with their habitat. A lot of these fish might also have some stripes like those sheep's head right there. And if you like to go fishing, you may have seen those before. All right, let's see what's over here. Awesome. Okay, so we have some mangrove roots here. Remember, these are the red mangrove roots. You might see some barnacles attached. All right, a little bit of seagrass there. All right, now we're up at the surface, looking at those leaves again, ducking back down. See what else we can find. All right, so we're looking at oysters. We might even see some snails down there. Oop, mangrove root right there. Just kind of scooch out of the way. There we go. All right, more mangrove roots. You can see that are really reaching down towards the seabed. And all those oysters have attached themselves to the roots. Makes a really nice home for them, and they get to filter out the water, get some nice food, and make it cleaner for us. Win-win situation. Oh yeah, there's a crab right there. That's a good size little crab. Oh, we have a lot of crown conch around here, so that big shell you're seeing there is actually a snail. A lot of people don't know that, but there's an animal living inside of there. Ooh, more fish. So we have lots of different species of fish living here, using the habitat, looking for food. All right, let's surface up near the boat. Okay, so we've seen a little bit above the surface, below the surface, and the seabed, and I would love to answer any more questions that you have for me.
All right, so I'm reading here. Sounds good. So this question is crazy, and I love it, and is the best example of lateral thinking. So if humans cannot see air, but can see water, can fish see air but not water? That's wow.
You all are getting very philosophical,
Awesome
thinking
question.
deeply here. So in the same way that we can tell there's a difference between air and water, fish can tell there's a difference between water and air. So I guess that's the answer to that question. If they're looking up at the surface, they can tell that the water stops at some point.
Oh, some good stuff. So how do plankton help us breathe? Let's go for that one.
Excellent. Okay, so in general, there are two different types of plankton. We have zooplankton, which is spelled Z-O-O, so like a zoo. That's the animal plankton. And we have phytoplankton. Phyto basically means plant. So we have our animals and our plants. And just like plants that are larger that we can see, they photosynthesize, they take in carbon dioxide, and they release or produce oxygen. So some of that oxygen stays in the water. A lot of that oxygen comes out into our atmosphere, into our air. And actually, about 50% of the air that we breathe is not produced by the rainforest. It's actually produced in the ocean. So thank you, plankton.
So there's some multiple questions about the drone. Okay. So and I'm going to answer some of them. Alison will do the other ones. So the first one says, how much does the drone cost? Depends. Varying models that are in the market go from a couple $100s to millions and millions of dollars. So it depends on what equipment you're using. How did the drone cable not get stuck in the roots, Alison?
So the drone cable is flexible, and so it just kind of moves as the drone moves. Also, we did not put that drone around the roots. We just kind of zoomed up to it and then kind of backed away. So it can go forward, it can reverse. So we have the capability to sort of maneuver that drone in order to not get it stuck. Not to say it couldn't happen, but that time it did not.
Wonderful thinking, guys. I love it. Now, how deep is the water the drone was just in? And I guess that question is going to, how deep is the estuary or those mangroves? How deep is that area in general?
Yeah, so in Tampa Bay, estuaries in general, actually, are very, very shallow on average. So Tampa Bay, the average depth is about 11 feet. So not very deep at all. Down in Sarasota, where Mote Marine Laboratory and Aquarium is, Sarasota Bay is only about 5 feet depth on average. So it's a great place for animals to live without fear of a lot of large predators. And it's a great place for people to hang out.
All right. Now, let's move a little bit to questions regarding animals. It says, Duval, how do oysters open and close by themselves to move?
Okay, so that's a two-part question. So I'm just going to use my scallop. It's not the same animal, but it is a type of bivalve. So at their hinges here, they do have some muscles that are part of their body that help them to open and close their shell. However, oysters don't move once they have become cemented in their oyster reef. When they're younger and just developing, they can be free swimming and they just kind of move around with the water currents. And then when they feel like they're in a good place, they settle down, they cement into other oysters, and they stay there. However, you might be thinking of scallops. So scallops are one of our bivalves that can actually swim. And what they do is they kind of they suck in water and they kind of squirt it out. So it's jet propulsion. So very similar to if you blow up a balloon and with air, and before you tie it off, you let it go. Air comes out one side, the balloon goes the other way. Very similar concept, just bring it underwater and it's water instead of air. Good question.
Yeah, absolutely. So we were asking about animals. How high can fish jump?
Oh, okay, that's a good question. It depends on what kind of fish it is. Here in Tampa Bay and Sarasota Bay, we have mullet. They could probably jump a couple feet above the surface. But if you're talking about a larger fish like a shark, they can jump out higher. Stingrays also, actually I have very scientific demonstration here. This is a spotted eagle ray. So this is a type of fish. And they can jump out really high. So in fact, at Mote, we actually had some studies going on with spotted eagle rays, and we had to have a net around the tank, a huge tank, just because they can be very acrobatic and jump out.
Another question, talking about flying fish, have you ever found one? So, where do they live?
So I did some studies in Hawaii. That's where I've seen the most flying fish, but I know that they live elsewhere in the world. Jorge, you might be able to answer this question.
Oh, I've seen them many times.
Do we have them here?
I've seen them many times. I've seen them here in Tampa Bay.
Okay.
They're more of pelagic species. They're more in open water. And why do they fly? That'll be the next question.
It's just a way of moving. However, a lot of fish do jump out to escape predation. So if there's a larger fish behind them trying to gobble them up, they just get out of the water. Some other animals, including fish, scientists think they might be trying to knock off parasites or dead skin when they jump, and then the impact kind of does that. But that's still up for debate, and that's why I love science, because there's always questions to ask and to answer.
I've seen them jumping out of the water to escape predators. So these little flying fish are the favorite fish of big, fast animals like sailfish and the sailfish and marlins. So they breach to escape. Are there any animals in the estuary that can survive in fresh water?
Yes. So part of the deal in living in an estuary is a lot of these animals do have to adapt to really rapidly changing conditions. So they might be out of water, they might be underwater, they might be in fresher water or saltier water. So manatees are a great example of that. And in fact, even though they are large marine mammals and they look like they would have a lot of blubber, they actually can't stay warm with only their bodies in the winter. So they will migrate up into Florida's freshwater springs where the temperature is constant and they can stay warm during the winter. So pretty soon here, we'll start seeing that migration of manatees up a little bit north. Another example of that is a bull shark. So bull sharks are one of the few species that have a really high tolerance for a range of salinities. So yes, they live in the ocean, but they can definitely go up river mouths pretty far up the river. So,
Alison, here's some more personal questions for you that I think
Sure.
are awesome.
Okay.
So we have one from Mary who says, what caused you to be interested in nature? And on that same note, there's another one from Rhonda that says, the students would like to know, what is your favorite fish? So what got you interested in nature, and what is your favorite fish?
Okay, so I'll start with what got me interested in nature. As a kid, I was outside all the time, and I think I just naturally had a curiosity for what was happening outside my window and in different environments. And I was fortunate enough to be able to visit some other places. I grew up in New Jersey, so there is ocean there. I would head to the ocean and I just loved it. I could stare at it forever. But then I also had some opportunities to visit some family in the Caribbean. And so I did my first dive there, and I just fell in love with the ocean. And not only was I interested in it, I really felt a passion for protecting it and making sure it stays pristine and clean and healthy. So that's kind of what got me interested in science in general. I also really loved bees and ants. Those were my first two science books. So I love all science. And then the next question I forgot already. So Jorge, can you remind me, please?
What is your favorite fish?
My favorite fish. That's why I was trying to avoid it. I love everything in the ocean, so picking favorites is really tough for me. I've got to say right now, I love, this is so hard. I love puffers. I think they're adorable. I showed you this little burrfish, and I think it was really cool for me to catch one. It looked like a little pearl. It was the size of a thumbnail, basically. And I thought it was some sort of seed or, some sort of seaweed something, but it was white. And then once it calmed down, then I saw it was a little baby burrfish. But I really do love seahorses too. I think they're just so unique and interesting. And, instead of having regular scales like a fish, they basically have this suit of armor and they just look weird, right? They're just interesting, interesting fish. Yeah, I will say there are 30,000 species of fish, so that was a really tough question. And of course, sharks are fish as well. So I could tell you my favorite shark too, if you want to know.
All right, some sensory questions here, and we're coming to the hour. We will stay and we will answer every single question there is to answer, but it's 11:50. So some sensory questions. Gainesville wants to know, can fish smell? And Duval is asking, can fish hear?
Okay, yes and yes. But again, there are lots of different species, so the degree to which they can hear and smell is variable. We actually have, I'll start with hearing first. We actually have a really cool program at Mote where we're studying acoustics. So all of the underwater sounds that are taking place that we as humans can't really hear. But when we use special equipment like hydrophones, which is basically just an underwater microphone, we can actually hear things. And fish make a lot of noise. And so unlike animals that you're used to hearing make noise like dolphins and whales and things like that, they make a lot of weird sounds and they use that for communication. So of course they can hear each other and sort of interpret those sounds. As far as smelling, I'm just going to use the shark as an example. Shark is a type of fish. So in general, there are bony fish that have skeletons like us made from bones, and then cartilaginous fish like your stingrays and skates and sharks. All of their bones are made from cartilage, same stuff in your ears and your nose. So sharks, as an example of a cartilaginous fish, have an amazing sense of smell, and they have nostrils like we do. They're not using them to breathe, it's only for smell. They're called nares. And basically the smell goes in one and kind of goes out the other. And not only are sharks able to detect smell, they know exactly how far away it is and which direction it's coming from. So other fish can also smell, but maybe just not as well as sharks.
Okay.
Great question.
Sharks. What is your favorite shark and why?
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to say two. It always changes, but right now I'm going to say the whale shark, just because it's the largest and it's just got such a unique coloration. So it's got polka dots all over its body. And even though it's huge, it's a filter feeder. So it's just a little bit unique in the shark world. But I do also love bonnet heads, which is a local species that we have. They look like little mini hammerheads. And they're actually known as the only omnivorous shark. They're the only shark that eats both animals and plants. So you might find one in a seagrass bed just offshore because that's what they love to eat. So those are my two favorites for now, but there are so many cool species of sharks, about 500 and counting species of sharks. So the more I learn, the more I get excited about sharks.
What is the biggest sea creature?
The largest sea creature is the blue whale. So that is our largest marine mammal, largest animal on Earth. And they are 100 feet long, which is just incredible to think about. And our largest shark, just by comparison, the whale shark is about 40 to 50 feet long. So really huge animal. That's also just going back to the personal question you asked me before. Why did I get involved in science? Why did I find it exciting? I grew up in New Jersey, so I had the American Museum of Natural History in New York City that I visited with school field trips with my parents, and they have a life-size blue whale hanging from the ceiling. And it's just incredible to see. And I couldn't imagine something so big living in the ocean or anywhere on Earth. And so it just kind of piqued my interest.
So let's jump into some questions. I'm trying to group them up about this kind of about salinity, okay?
Sure.
So why are there not the same type of fish in Tampa Bay that are in different parts of the world? That came from Danielle. And another one on the same token, it says the students would like to know, how can fish migrate safely up the river without being eaten by predators?
Okay, so the reason why there are different populations, different species of fish living all over the world is that's actually kind of an easy answer for me. So just like humans, we have a range of living quality, a range of living parameters that we feel comfortable in. Same with fish. So some fish like when it's cold. Some fish only want to be in tropical areas. And so even though, you know, around the globe there are areas that are the same temperature in the water, it's what they eat. It's just how they have evolved over time. And so that's why you might find fish here that we don't have in Australia. And I'm just going to take a little detour on this question. That's also why when we have fish introduced from other areas, like the lionfish that we have here, it's meant to be in the Indo-Pacific region. It lives here now. It really causes a huge problem in the ecosystem because it's not meant to be here. There are no predators that want to eat it. It can eat whatever it wants pretty much. And so it's become a huge problem. So we call that an invasive species. but it's really important that animals that are native to a certain area stay there. And the next question, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with my, with my memory today. The next question was about.
The next question said, and I'm going to add another one there.
Okay.
It says, the students would like to know how can fish migrate safely upriver without being eaten by predators? And then tagging on with that about salinity, it says, are there any animals in the estuary that can survive in freshwater? I think we asked that one.
Yep. So so remember the manatees and bull sharks, but there are a number of other animals too that can kind of live in a range of salinities. And fish can migrate upriver. I'm not sure which species you're thinking of, but the same way they would be undetected by predators out in the ocean. So a lot of fish have really cryptic coloration, so they blend into their surroundings, or some fish are really silvery, like a tarpon, for example. They hang out near the surface, and so when predators are looking at them from below, that sunlight glare coming in kind of confuses them. It's hard for the predator to see the fish. So yeah, just by existing, really. And of course they know, you know, if there's any sort of structure they can hide around or underneath, or yeah, nearby, they'll use that too.
And Alison, there, salmon are a great example of fish that migrate upriver, and
Yes.
it's part of their life cycle to go upriver into fresh water and then back to the ocean.
And they don't all escape predation.
Correct. They don't always make it. Now, you were talking about bull sharks. So are they more aggressive than great whites?
So in general, sharks are not interested in people really at all. And the only time there's really a negative interaction is either when they think we're something else that they might want to eat, like a sea turtle or a sea lion or a seal or something like that, or when we are pestering them. So a lot of people get real brave and they want to, you know, for a nurse shark, for example, that hangs out near the bottom, they might grab their tail. And so obviously that shark's going to defend itself. With that said, there are some sharks that are known to be a little bit more aggressive, but also just because where they live kind of intersects with where humans hang out, right? So bull sharks can hang out along the coast. That's where people hang out. So that's why you might hear about more encounters between bull sharks and humans. But some other sharks, great whites, just because they're big and they're amazing predators, you might hear about some interactions there, or encounters. And then tiger sharks are also known to be a little bit more aggressive. But again, they're not really interested in us. And generally, even if they take a test to bite, because their taste buds are way back in their throat, they generally don't finish that meal. So they spit us out. They just happen to have really, really sharp teeth. So yeah.
We have 1 minute, and one last question here. I think we've gotten to most of them. Duval, do any sea creatures have electrical components?
Yes. However, I would say the electric eel that everyone's probably the most familiar with is actually not an oceanic species. That's a freshwater eel, and it's actually not even really an eel. So yes, there are some animals, especially in the deep sea, that might have some electrical charge as defense or as a way to capture prey. But generally, we don't really have any of that around here.
And well, that concludes our broadcast for today. We will keep the chat open for a few minutes, and we're going to get to answer any questions that are left unanswered. There was a question about mangoes and oak trees somewhere. We're going to try and do our best Googling to answer it in the chat. But I want to thank everybody for participating today, for joining this event. I hope you had fun. Thank you, Alison, for your wonderful guidance in this class. Thank you for our amazing team of experts behind the cameras who have worked hours and hours to get this to you in a really smooth and high quality way. And I hope to see you soon. We're going to have these events coming up twice every year, regardless of COVID or whatnot. So keep an eye on this channel. And we're hoping to be able to have kids and staff members again on the Orlando's Rose pretty soon. Thank you, everybody, for your participation, and have a good lunch.